The 18th Amendment, as you know, became part of the Constitution after a very long, drawn-out campaign. When Nebraska became the 36th state on January 16, 1919, to ratify the amendment to ban the manufacture, sale, transport, import, and export of intoxicating beverages. Prohibition formed part of a wave of liquor control measures that had snowballed during World War I in many sort of heavily drinking Western nations. But the United States proved somewhat unique as a large industrial nation in its absolutist approach to the problem of excessive drink and to addiction, banning wine, beer, and distilled liquors in one fell swoop. The 18th Amendment was hugely ambitious in its scope. One contemporary observer labeled it the most sweeping effort in history to reshape the social behavior of an entire nation. It was also the first time the Constitution was amended to sharply restrict rather than to protect personal freedoms. Not surprisingly then, the law preoccupied public discourse for well over a decade. It reshaped American legal doctrines, institutions, and agencies, and also proved hugely controversial. In less than 15 years, it became the first and remains the only constitutional amendment to have been rescinded. Prohibition's consequential and lasting legacies then remained, until recently, somewhat neglected. This story reveals Prohibition, the Prohibition era, as an important moment of federal penal state building, one that pushed the American state in the direction of policing and surveillance permanently. As importantly, 50 years into the women's history revolution, it also reveals the multiple gender dimensions and the role of women in the law's coming, its unfolding, and its consequences. Since the establishment of the young settler colonial outpost, Americans had been steeped in heavy drink. And just as in Europe, a vibrant temperance movement emerged to rein in those patterns of heavy drinking. In the 19th century, undisciplined drink seemed less at home in an increasingly market-driven world where self-discipline and control were central to the rising bourgeoisie and the rising bourgeois household. By the late 19th century, this huge and diverse campaign that ranged across and included groups such as Terence Powderly's Knights of Labor, African American Templars, organizations, and many others, succeeded in reducing sharply the problem of excessive drink. So rates plummet of hard alcohol consumption per capita in the United States. But at the same moment, beer consumption escalates radically and quite dramatically with the arrival and new cultural habits of a nation of immigrants. The very powerful and energetic grassroots organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was established in 1873 and emerged rapidly to become one of the most prominent female reform organizations of the late 19th and early 20th century, bringing women into the public sphere under the banner of home protection. Public male drinking in the saloon became the animus and incredible sharp focus for those who advocated prohibition, with the working man's pub identified as a kind of concrete space that encapsulated a host of threatening developments. And that was sort of the shifts and changes with industrialization, urbanization, proletarianization, mass poverty, immigration, you name it. Sort of eradicating the saloon was seen as a kind of helpful solution to dealing with those problems. Liquor at this time in the early 20th century increasingly became seen as a kind of narcotic poison, a drug dangerous to mind and body, so it was less a religious ethos and more a scientific ethos, kind of public health ethos as a problem too dangerous to be, a commodity too dangerous to be regulated, that it must be banned. So temperance, progressivism, prohibition, and women's suffrage were to a certain extent allied and synergetic reforms. They form part of the same spirit of activism, and in particular constitutional activism, that led to a wave of amendments in this period, namely 4 and 5 years, from the direct election of senators, the income tax, of course, prohibition, and following on its heels, women's suffrage. And just that in itself should give you a sense of the extent to which there was an allied group of reformers working for some of these efforts. It took World War I to put prohibition over the top. I think that we would not have had the national prohibition the way that we did, the sharp, complete ban of all alcohol, including wine and beer, without World War I, its clamor for efficiency, ending waste, war preparedness, and the expansion, of course, of government authority on all fronts, which made prohibition seem far more in line with these other forms of government expansion. Prohibition was then sent to the states by December of 1917, or passed at Congress at that point. So Polish, Irish, Italian, and others, working class women, equally were concerned about the problem of the saloon and the evils of, or quote unquote, what was called the evils of excessive drink. The problems of addiction. They did not necessarily sharply turn to a ban on the trade, and there's a lot of sort of records through settlement houses that kind of try to get to neighborhood sentiment, and you can see there's a kind of sharp divide and a lot of opposition among immigrant women over this issue. And they saw it as a sort of attack on their communities, rightly so, on the cultural habits of their communities, but also were concerned about the use of the coercive arm of the law and how the state might be utilized to penalize their communities. And the unfolding of the law, I think, proved quite presciently those concerns, even far beyond what they might have imagined. So in contrast to our sort of popular conceptions that the law was not enforced or was kind of a joke, and in places like New York it probably seemed like a joke, prohibition was enforced at the federal, state, and local levels by an increasingly powerful and intrusive state. Remember, the state was puny at this time, so this is a big, ambitious effort, but has huge repercussions in building this sort of policing arm of the state. Despite its manifest gap and imperfections and regional variations, many Americans, and especially poor men and women, found themselves ensnared in one or more of prohibition's webs, arrested, charged, fined, or incarcerated by local, state, or federal agents. And this selective enforcement is a darker underside in what we tend in the popular imagination to think of as the Roaring Twenties. And it's partly because I think there's a kind of class divide over who could drink freely and who was less able to. Now, women were participants, even if on the marginal edge of this hugely profitable illicit criminal rings on the supply side of the industry. Prohibition, despite the efforts at enforcement, there was sort of an unending demand, not surprisingly, for drink, and it opened up a space, a less public space, but an innovative survival strategy for working class wives and mothers. Working class wives and mothers had long had these sort of sideline efforts that went well with raising children and being in the home, and prohibition offered another opportunity, not just to take in boarders, but to contribute to the family economy by setting up a home brewing operation or making wine for the family or for sale, providing a way to supplement family income for poor women willing to run the risk. Small-scale moonshine operations were frequently family businesses, with women at the kitchen stoves and children serving as deliverers. So working-class women participated on the supply side of the underground traffic, and their novel rates of incarceration offer a grim counterpart to the popular narratives of youthful flappers and glamorous speakeasy queens, some of which received an inordinate amount of attention. But those narratives, it's important to note, were not wholly wrong, of course. Not that our memory of those years is completely, fabricated. And that brings me to sort of the importance of women within the sort of participation in Prohibition era nightlife. So a small subset of well-to-do, kind of pace-setting, elite adventurers, places particularly like New York and Chicago, big urban metropolises, stepped out with middle-class women following their lead, much more well-protected in this kind of corrupt chain of illicit nightlife from those who in organized crime could afford these protected clubs. From the arm of the law, right, from the draconian arm of the law. And their prohibition fostered this new world of subterranean nightlife leisure. So the closure of saloons, which really, interestingly enough, were of course sites of all male public sociability. Women were barred, by and large, from saloons, and if they dared enter into saloons, they risked being identified as prostitutes, right? So by closing the saloon and opening up new avenues of semi-secretive kind of forms of leisure, Prohibition helped to mediate women's entry into new forms of sociability. Women's participation in this new world built upon long-term trends, such as women's increasingly economic independence and new job opportunities away from home during World War I. And in the war's wake, then, large numbers of unaccompanied women, single, independent, wage-earning women, most likely, could be found in these prohibition venues. Their less affluent sisters, though, and this is important also to remember when we think about these kind of romanticized visions of these spaces, were often present as employees. So nightclub owners recruited young women, some of the same women that were coming to cities to find their way, by higher pay than they might earn in a factory or an office for jobs as hostesses, waitresses, cigarette girls, and in serving in this unregulated nightclub scene. Hostesses would ply male patrons with expensive drinks by providing entertainment, including sometimes sexual favors. And so like other celebrated moments of sexual liberation, something we think about, more permissive sexual norms in this new world, the liberation associated with the more permissive sexual norms of drink of the 20s applied better to the consumer side than to the supply side. A very important consequence of these efforts was to overflow the nation's prisons and to strain the courts to the breaking point. This was a moment when the nation experienced the first dramatic expansion of prison growth at the federal and state level. At the federal level, from 1920 to 1930, the number of prisoners in federal prisons close to tripled, with the highest class of long-term violators being, not surprisingly, prohibition violators. From 1930 to 1940, doubled again. The large number of women participating in the illicit traffic, in fact, led Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt, another woman sort of at the forefront of enforcement, a really fascinating figure, to plead to Congress for funds to build a new women's prison to deal with what she called a crisis of numbers of female violators. And as a result, the first federal prison for women was opened up in Alderson, West Virginia by 1927. Female violators, often in front of the courts, pleaded for leniency as desperate mothers or dutiful wives, using sort of gender tropes to try to get leniency on their sentences. But nonetheless, children of female violators frequently ended up in foster care with charity organizations while their mothers served out sentences. These semi-secretive night spots forced, of course, crossing of legal boundaries, and they encouraged rebellion of all sorts and cultural experimentation of all sorts. This, outside of the purview of state surveillance, of parents, and of legality, right, opened up doors of new adventures, new experimentation, and pansy shows, queer reviews, beauty and masquerade balls thrived in this unregulated spaces, as well as kind of crossing of racial boundaries and racial geographies. Prohibition's cultural earthquake upended nightlife in urban centers in places, big urban metropolises, but it radiated with greater consequences in many ways in rural towns and cities, brought there by whether it be jazz on the radio, Hollywood movie plots with backdrops of speakeasies, tabloid newspapers that followed the escapades of this kind of small, smart set, And as a result, much to the consternation of men and women who worked so hard for its passage, became increasingly anxious, right? This was the law of the land. It was in the Constitution, for God's sake, right? And there was all of this problem of a lack of observance. Prohibition served, much to the sort of concern of these men and women, as a cultural accelerant, or what I term a cultural accelerant. Coming after decades-long emergence of urban industrial culture, it helped to sweep the nation into an increasing embrace of ideals of self-fulfillment, pleasure, and liberation within the segmented world of leisure. It's at this moment that we get the establishment of the first large-scale federal crime commission. It's at this moment where we get the establishment of the Uniform Crime Reports to track criminal knowledge, something that has had a huge impact on the way we understand criminal knowledge ever since. And what's fascinating, in a very brief aside, is that at this moment, it's when it was discussed who should be reporting the criminal statistics. There was a big debate. Should it be the victims, some statisticians argued, which would have enabled, of course, crimes that were not reported, for example, rape or police brutality, to be reported. But it's at this moment that the police fought hard and won to have police reporting to the FBI, something that has shaped criminal knowledge and hidden other forms of crime ever since. This is the moment when the FBI gains wider purview for its mission, coming off the war on alcohol in 32 and 34, and when policing is professionalized and bureaucratized at all levels, following the federal playbook. It's the moment we get a vast expansion and reorganization of the prison system and the establishment of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and a sort of escalation of criminal social science knowledge at all levels, backed by social science experts, and a meteoric change then in their volume and impact. And finally, it's the moment when the Federal Bureau of Narcotics is born directly out of the Prohibition Bureau. The Prohibition law proved a powerful grievance for urban immigrant and heavily Catholic working class men and women, along with African Americans and other minorities that were targeted. Klan terror, selective enforcement, the closure of saloons, the penetration of organized crime largely in poor, often working class neighborhoods, and the law's identification as an attack on immigrant culture sharpened the politicization of these men and women and forged them into a potent political bloc. So in 1928, they coalesced in the Democratic Party as never before around a candidate, Al Smith, from New York, an immigrant and a Catholic, who ran under the banner of prohibition opposition and also tolerance, right? He sort of decried and condemned the Klan in contrast to much of the rest of the Democratic Party. So this sort of mobilization and movement in 1928 was sort of core to laying the foundation for the ethnic, urban, working class base. This was the moment when industrial workers move really sort of in a block into the Democratic Party, and African Americans for the first time begin that move away from the Republican Party into the Democratic Party, starting in places like Chicago and New York, that proceeds much more rapidly under the New Deal.